The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training facility as Marcus Thompson adjusted his gear for what he thought would be another routine exercise. At 22, Marcus had always dreamed of serving his country, and, after months of preparation, he had finally made it into the elite training program. His heart raced with excitement and nervousness as he looked around at the other recruits, all equally determined to prove themselves worthy. The training facility buzzed with activity as dozens of young men and women prepared for the day's challenges. Marcus had heard stories about the intensity of military training, but nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold. He checked his equipment one last time, making sure everything was secure and ready for action. Sergeant Davis, a stern-faced man with over 15 years of military experience, stepped forward to address the group. His voice carried across the training ground with authority that immediately commanded attention from every recruit present. Today's exercise will test your ability to work under pressure and follow orders without question, he announced, his eyes scanning the faces of the eager trainees. Marcus felt a surge of determination as he listened to the instructions. This was his chance to prove that he belonged here, that all the preparation and sacrifice had been worth it. He had left behind a comfortable life, a steady job, and the safety of his hometown to pursue this dream of serving his country with honor and distinction. The other recruits around him seemed equally focused and ready. There was Sarah, a former college athlete who had traded her scholarship for a chance to serve, David, whose father and grandfather had both been career military, and Jennifer, who had overcome significant personal challenges to earn her place in the program. Each person here had their own story, their own reasons for choosing this difficult path. As the group moved toward the training area, Marcus couldn't help but notice the intense atmosphere that surrounded them. The facility itself was impressive, with state-of-the-art equipment and carefully designed obstacles that would challenge every aspect of their physical and mental capabilities. Everything had been planned to push them to their limits and beyond. The first part of the exercise seemed straightforward enough. They would work in teams to navigate through various obstacles while carrying heavy equipment. Marcus found himself paired with 3 other recruits, and, together they began to tackle the challenges before them. The weight of the gear was significant, but manageable with proper teamwork and communication. However, as the morning progressed, Marcus began to notice that something felt different about this particular training session. The instructors seemed more aggressive than usual, their commands sharper and more demanding. What had started as challenging but fair exercises began to take on a darker tone that made several recruits visibly uncomfortable. Sergeant Davis approached Marcus's team as they struggled with a particularly difficult obstacle. Instead of offering guidance or constructive criticism, his words were harsh and personal. "You're not cut out for this, Thompson," he sneered, getting uncomfortably close to Marcus's face. "Maybe you should go back to whatever safe little life you came from." Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger, but he forced himself to remain calm and focused. He had been taught that part of military training involved breaking down individuals so they could be built back up stronger. He assumed this was just part of the process, even though it felt unnecessarily cruel. The situation continued to escalate throughout the morning. What should have been constructive training exercises became opportunities for certain instructors to single out specific recruits for harsh treatment. Marcus found himself becoming a particular target, though he couldn't understand why. He had followed every order, completed every task to the best of his ability, and maintained the respectful attitude he had been taught was essential. Other recruits began to notice the unfair treatment as well. Sarah whispered to Marcus during a brief break that she had never seen training conducted this way before. Her older brother had gone through a similar program, and, while it had been challenging, it had never involved the kind of personal attacks and humiliation they were witnessing. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a team-building exercise. Marcus's group was tasked with carrying a heavy log across a series of obstacles while blindfolded. The exercise required trust, communication, and coordination. However, instead of allowing the team to work together naturally, Sergeant Davis began shouting contradictory orders and deliberately creating confusion. When Marcus tried to help a teammate who had stumbled, Davis erupted in fury. "Did I tell you to help him, Thompson? You follow orders, not your feelings." The sergeant's face was red with anger as he continued his tirade, using language and personal attacks that went far beyond what anyone could consider appropriate training methods. The other instructors stood by, some looking uncomfortable but none speaking up. Marcus realized that this wasn't standard procedure, this was something else entirely. The exercise had stopped being about training and had become about power and humiliation. He could see the fear and confusion in his teammates' eyes as they struggled to understand what was happening. As the verbal abuse continued, Marcus felt his own anger rising. He had come here to serve his country and become the best soldier he could be. He had expected tough training, demanding exercises, and high standards. What he hadn't expected was to be treated like an enemy by the very people who were supposed to be preparing him for service. The psychological pressure was intense. Marcus began to question whether he had made a terrible mistake in joining the program. The dream that had motivated him for so long started to feel like a nightmare. He wondered if this was really what military service was about, or if he had somehow ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Despite his growing concerns, Marcus forced himself to continue. He completed each task as ordered, maintained his composure as best he could, and tried to support his fellow recruits who were also struggling with the increasingly hostile environment. He told himself that if he could just get through this day, things might return to normal. But, as the hours passed, it became clear that normal was not coming back anytime soon. The training had crossed a line from challenging to abusive, and Marcus found himself trapped in a situation where speaking up seemed impossible and staying silent felt like betrayal of everything he believed in. The other recruits looked to each other for support and understanding. They formed silent bonds of solidarity, knowing that they were all experiencing something that wasn't right. The shared ordeal created an unspoken agreement that they would help each other survive whatever was happening to them. As the first day of this twisted training came to an end, Marcus lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling. His body ached from the physical challenges, but his mind hurt even more from the psychological assault he had endured. He thought about his family, his friends back home, and the proud moment when he had first put on his uniform. The facility was quiet now, but Marcus could hear soft conversations from other bunks as recruits tried to process what they had experienced. Some talked about reporting the incidents, others worried about the consequences of speaking up. Everyone seemed to understand that they were in a situation that had gone far beyond normal training boundaries. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to remember why he had chosen this path in the first place. He thought about the stories his grandfather had told him about serving in World War II, about honor and duty and protecting others. Those ideals seemed very far away from what he had experienced today, but he held on to them like a lifeline in the darkness. He made a decision that night that would change everything. He would not quit, no matter how bad things got. He would find a way to survive this experience and emerge stronger on the other side. He owed it to himself, to his family, and to the ideals that had brought him here in the first place. What Marcus didn't know was that his real test was just beginning, and that salvation would come from an unexpected source. The next morning would bring even greater challenges, and Marcus would discover just how far some people were willing to go in the name of training. But he would also learn that there were still people in the military who remembered what honor truly meant, and who were willing to risk everything to protect it. The second day began before dawn with harsh lights flooding the barracks and the sound of metal clanging against metal. Marcus jerked awake, his muscles still sore from the previous day's ordeal. Around him, other recruits stirred with the same mixture of exhaustion and dread that had settled over the entire group like a heavy blanket. Sergeant Davis appeared in the doorway, his silhouette dark against the bright hallway lights. "Rise and shine, ladies," he barked, his voice carrying the same cruel edge that had characterized the previous day. "Hope you enjoyed your beauty sleep, because today we separate the real soldiers from the pretenders." Marcus quickly dressed and prepared his gear, trying to maintain the military bearing he had been taught was essential. He noticed that several of his fellow recruits moved more slowly than usual, their spirits clearly dampened by what they had endured. The enthusiasm and determination that had marked their first day had been replaced by a cautious wariness that shouldn't have existed in a legitimate training environment. The morning meal was eaten in relative silence, with only whispered conversations between close neighbors. Marcus found himself sitting next to David, whose military family background had initially made him confident about the training process. Now, David looked confused and troubled, clearly struggling to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had expected based on his family's stories. "This isn't right," David whispered, glancing around to make sure no instructors were within earshot. "My dad never talked about anything like this. Training is supposed to be tough, but it's supposed to build you up, not tear you down for no reason." Marcus nodded, grateful to hear someone else voice what they were all thinking. The validation helped him trust his own instincts about the situation. This wasn't normal military training, this was something else entirely, something that had gone wrong in ways that none of them fully understood yet. After breakfast, the group was marched to a different section of the training facility. This area looked more industrial, with concrete walls and harsh lighting that created deep shadows in the corners. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the early morning temperature as they were lined up for what Sergeant Davis called advanced psychological conditioning. The exercise began innocently enough, with recruits being asked to perform simple tasks while instructors shouted orders and created distractions. But, quickly, the situation escalated beyond anything that could be considered legitimate training methodology. The instructors began using personal information about the recruits' backgrounds, families, and motivations as weapons in their psychological assault. Marcus discovered that someone had been through his personal file in detail when Sergeant Davis began making specific references to his childhood, his family's financial struggles, and his reasons for joining the military. The invasion of privacy was disturbing enough, but the way this personal information was being weaponized against him was deeply unsettling. "Your daddy worked 2 jobs to help pay for your college, didn't he, Thompson?" Davis sneered during one particularly intense moment. "Wonder what he'd think if he knew his investment was wasted on someone too weak to handle real military service." The comment hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it was deliberately crafted to cause maximum emotional damage. His father had indeed worked extra hours to help with college expenses, and the sacrifice his family had made was one of the driving forces behind Marcus's desire to serve with honor and distinction. Other recruits were receiving similar treatment, with instructors digging into their personal histories to find vulnerabilities they could exploit. Sarah, the former athlete, was taunted about a sports injury that had ended her competitive career. Jennifer faced cruel comments about her family background and the financial hardships that had shaped her youth. The psychological pressure was intense and unrelenting. Marcus began to understand that this wasn't random hazing or even misguided training methods. This felt systematic and deliberate, as if someone had decided that these particular recruits needed to be broken down completely, though he couldn't fathom what the purpose might be. As the day progressed, the physical challenges became more dangerous and the safety protocols that should have been in place seemed to disappear entirely. During one obstacle course exercise, Marcus watched in horror as a fellow recruit was injured when safety equipment failed and no instructor moved to help immediately. The recruit, a quiet young man named Peter, lay on the ground clutching his ankle while Davis casually observed the situation. "Walk it off," Davis finally commanded, showing no concern for what was obviously a serious injury. "If you can't handle a little pain, you have no business being here." Marcus started to move toward Peter to offer assistance, but was immediately stopped by another instructor who physically blocked his path. "Did anyone give you permission to move, Thompson?" the instructor demanded. The message was clear: they were supposed to watch their fellow recruits suffer without being allowed to help. The incident with Peter's injury marked a turning point for many of the recruits. They began to realize that their safety and well-being were not priorities for the people running this training program. The careful protocols and safety measures they had expected from a professional military training facility seemed to be completely absent. During a brief break period, Marcus found himself in conversation with several other recruits who were expressing similar concerns. They spoke in hushed tones, always watching for approaching instructors, but the consensus was clear: something was seriously wrong with this entire situation. "I've been thinking about reporting this," Sarah said quietly, her usual confidence shaken by the day's events. "But who do we report it to? These are the people in charge of the program." It was a sobering question that highlighted just how trapped they all felt. The chain of command that was supposed to protect them seemed to be the same chain of command that was facilitating their mistreatment. They were isolated from the outside world, dependent on their instructors for everything from food to communication with their families. Marcus thought about his own attempts to contact his family. The promised phone privileges had been mysteriously unavailable, and written communications were supposedly being held up by administrative delays. He was beginning to suspect that their isolation was deliberately maintained to prevent word of what was happening from reaching the outside world. The afternoon brought what was supposed to be combat training exercises, but these too had been perverted into something that bore little resemblance to legitimate military instruction. Instead of learning proper techniques and safety procedures, recruits were being pushed into dangerous situations without adequate preparation or protection. Marcus found himself paired with David for a hand-to-hand combat exercise that should have been carefully supervised and controlled. Instead, Sergeant Davis encouraged them to really go at each other while providing minimal instruction on proper technique or safety protocols. The exercise quickly became less about learning and more about surviving the aggressive environment the instructors had created. When David accidentally struck Marcus harder than intended, causing a cut above his eye, Davis laughed and called for them to continue without any medical attention. "A little blood never hurt anyone," he declared, though the injury clearly needed proper care to prevent infection and ensure proper healing. The disregard for basic safety and medical care was becoming a pattern that frightened all the recruits. They were being treated not as valuable future soldiers who deserved proper training and protection, but as disposable objects in some kind of twisted experiment or power game. As evening approached, Marcus noticed that several recruits were showing signs of serious stress beyond what would be expected from even the most challenging legitimate training program. Some had stopped eating properly, others were having obvious difficulty sleeping, and a few were beginning to show signs of the kind of psychological breakdown that could have lasting consequences. The situation had clearly moved beyond poor training methods or overly aggressive instructors. This was systematic abuse disguised as military preparation, and Marcus knew that someone needed to find a way to stop it before permanent damage was done to everyone involved. That night, as he lay in his bunk trying to process everything that had happened, Marcus made a decision that would require tremendous courage. He would find a way to document what was happening and get word to someone in authority who could intervene. He didn't know how he would accomplish this in their isolated and controlled environment, but he knew he had to try. What Marcus didn't know was that someone had already been watching the situation unfold, someone with the experience and authority to recognize abuse when he saw it. Help was closer than he realized, but the worst was yet to come before salvation would arrive in the most unexpected way possible. The third day would bring challenges that would push several recruits to their breaking points, and Marcus would discover just how far some people were willing to go when they believed no one was watching or capable of stopping them. The third day dawned with an ominous feeling that settled over the entire training facility like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Marcus woke to find that two of his fellow recruits, including Peter who had been injured the day before, were missing from their bunks. When he quietly asked another recruit about their whereabouts, he received only a worried shake of the head and a whispered warning to keep his voice down. The absence of Peter and his bunkmate created an atmosphere of fear that was palpable among the remaining recruits. No explanation was offered for their disappearance, and the instructors acted as if nothing unusual had occurred. This deliberate silence was perhaps more unsettling than any direct threat could have been. Sergeant Davis appeared for morning formation with an expression that suggested today's activities would be even more challenging than what they had already endured. "We're going to find out who among you has what it takes to be a real soldier," he announced, his voice carrying an undertone of menace that made several recruits visibly uncomfortable. The first exercise of the day involved what Davis called stress inoculation training, but which bore no resemblance to any legitimate military training protocol Marcus had ever heard described. Recruits were forced to perform complex tasks while being subjected to psychological pressure that went far beyond anything that could be considered educational or preparatory. Marcus found himself selected as the first subject for this twisted exercise. He was placed in a small, windowless room with concrete walls and told to disassemble and reassemble a weapon while instructors screamed contradictory orders at him from all sides. The noise was deafening, the instructions impossible to follow simultaneously, and the entire situation designed to create failure rather than success. When Marcus inevitably made mistakes due to the impossible conditions, Davis erupted in a fury that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. "You just got your entire unit killed, Thompson," he screamed, his face inches from Marcus's own. "Is that what you want? To be responsible for the deaths of good soldiers because you can't handle pressure?" The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and cruel. Davis was using Marcus's own dedication and sense of responsibility against him, creating a scenario where failure was inevitable and, then, blaming him for caring about the fictional consequences. It was a technique designed to break down self-confidence and create learned helplessness. Other recruits were subjected to similar treatment throughout the morning, each facing exercises that seemed specifically designed to exploit their individual weaknesses and insecurities. Sarah was forced to navigate an obstacle course while being told repeatedly that she was weak and didn't belong in military service. David faced scenarios that attacked his family's military legacy and suggested he was a disappointment to their tradition of service. The cruelty was systematic and personal, going far beyond what could be justified as preparation for military service. Marcus began to suspect that this entire program was some kind of illegal experiment or that they had somehow become victims of people who had no legitimate authority to conduct military training. During what should have been a lunch break, the recruits were instead subjected to what Davis called nutrition discipline training. This involved being given insufficient food while being forced to watch instructors eat full meals, all while being lectured about how soldiers in combat situations often faced shortages and hardships. The starvation tactics were clearly designed to weaken them physically and mentally, making them more vulnerable to psychological manipulation and less able to resist whatever was being done to them. Marcus could see the effects on his fellow recruits, who were becoming increasingly listless and compliant as their physical condition deteriorated. It was during this meal restriction exercise that Marcus first noticed the man watching from the observation area above the training floor. The observer was not wearing the same uniform as the regular instructors, and something about his bearing suggested a level of authority and experience that set him apart from everyone else Marcus had seen at the facility. The man stood quietly, taking notes and observing everything with an intensity that suggested he was evaluating not just the recruits, but the entire training program itself. Marcus caught his eye for just a moment and saw something there that gave him hope, a look of concern and disapproval that suggested not everyone in authority was complicit in what was happening. The afternoon brought the most dangerous exercise yet attempted. Recruits were told they would participate in live fire training, but the safety protocols that should have accompanied such exercises were completely absent. Instead of proper protective equipment and carefully controlled conditions, they were given minimal gear and placed in situations that put them at genuine risk of serious injury or death. Marcus found himself crawling through an obstacle course while live ammunition was being fired over his head at heights that seemed dangerously low. The sound of bullets passing overhead was terrifying, and he could see dirt kicked up by shots that appeared to be much closer to the recruits than any safe training protocol would allow. When one recruit, a young woman named Lisa, froze in terror during the exercise, Davis showed no concern for her safety or mental state. Instead, he began screaming at her to move while continuing to fire rounds that sent dirt spraying around her position. The situation was clearly out of control, with Davis more concerned about maintaining his authority than protecting the lives of the people under his command. It was at this moment that everything changed. The man Marcus had noticed earlier suddenly appeared on the training floor, moving with a speed and authority that immediately commanded attention from everyone present. He was tall and muscular, with the kind of presence that suggested extensive combat experience and unquestioned competence. "Cease fire," the man commanded in a voice that cut through all other noise like a blade. The authority in his voice was absolute, and even Davis immediately stopped his dangerous game. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The stranger approached Davis with the controlled movement of someone who was accustomed to dangerous situations and knew exactly how to handle them. His uniform bore insignia that Marcus didn't immediately recognize, but everyone present seemed to understand that this was someone with significant authority and experience. "Sir, we're conducting combat training exercises as ordered," Davis stammered, his previous confidence evaporating in the face of this unexpected intervention. The bravado and cruelty he had shown toward the recruits disappeared instantly when confronted by someone who clearly outranked him. "Combat training," the man replied, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of controlled anger. "What I see is criminal endangerment of personnel under your command. You're relieved of duty, effective immediately." The transformation in the atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Davis, who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just moments before, now appeared small and uncertain as he faced someone with real authority and the courage to use it properly. The other instructors who had been complicit in the abuse suddenly found themselves looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. Marcus helped Lisa to her feet and guided her to safety while the stranger continued his confrontation with Davis. Other recruits gathered around, unsure what was happening but sensing that their ordeal might finally be coming to an end. The relief was overwhelming, but Marcus cautioned himself against optimism until he understood more about who this man was and what authority he had to intervene. The stranger introduced himself to the recruits in terms that made everything clear. "I'm Commander James Harrison, Navy SEAL Team 6. I've been investigating reports of irregularities in this training program, and what I've witnessed today confirms that serious crimes have been committed against military personnel." The words Navy SEAL carried weight that everyone understood. These were among the most elite and respected soldiers in the entire military, with reputations for both extraordinary competence and absolute integrity. If a Navy SEAL commander said that crimes had been committed, then crimes had definitely been committed. Commander Harrison immediately ordered medical attention for all recruits who had been injured, proper food and water for everyone, and a complete halt to all training activities pending a full investigation. The transformation from nightmare to salvation was so sudden that some recruits seemed unable to process what was happening. As medical personnel arrived to treat injuries and assess the condition of the recruits, Marcus realized that their ordeal was truly over. But he also understood that the implications of what had happened would extend far beyond their own experience. This had been systematic abuse disguised as military training, and people would be held accountable. Commander Harrison approached Marcus personally as the medical evaluation was taking place. "Son, I need you to know that what happened here was not military training in any legitimate sense. You and your fellow recruits were victims of criminal misconduct, and we're going to make sure those responsible face the full consequences of their actions." The relief Marcus felt was overwhelming, but it was mixed with anger at how unnecessarily they had all suffered and concern for the recruits who had been broken by the experience. Peter and his missing bunkmate were found in medical isolation, where they had been placed after suffering psychological breakdowns that Davis had been covering up to hide the extent of his misconduct. As the day ended, Marcus understood that while their immediate suffering was over, the process of healing and seeking justice was just beginning. But, for the first time in 3 days, he felt hope and pride in military service again, restored by the example of a leader who embodied the values that had originally inspired Marcus to serve his country. The hours following Commander Harrison's intervention felt surreal to Marcus and the other recruits. After 3 days of systematic abuse, the sudden presence of legitimate authority and genuine concern for their welfare was almost overwhelming. Medical personnel moved efficiently through the facility, documenting injuries and providing treatment that should have been available from the beginning. Commander Harrison had established a temporary command center in what had previously been Davis's office, and Marcus could see through the windows that he was conducting phone calls with what appeared to be very high-ranking officials. The Navy SEAL's demeanor was calm and professional, but there was an underlying intensity that suggested serious consequences were coming for those responsible. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the military psychologist who had arrived with the medical team, spent considerable time with each recruit individually. Her approach was gentle but thorough, and Marcus found himself able to speak openly about the psychological manipulation and abuse they had endured for the first time since arriving at the facility. "What you experienced was not military training," Dr. Martinez explained during Marcus's session. "It was a systematic program of abuse that violated every protocol and regulation governing the treatment of military personnel. None of what happened to you was your fault, and none of it was necessary or beneficial to your development as soldiers." The validation was healing in ways Marcus hadn't expected. He had begun to doubt his own perceptions and wonder if he was simply too weak to handle real military training. Learning that his instincts had been correct, that the treatment they received was genuinely abusive and illegal, helped him begin to process the trauma of the experience. Other recruits were having similar conversations with Dr. Martinez and the other mental health professionals who had been brought in. Sarah, who had maintained her composure throughout most of the ordeal, finally broke down and cried as she described the fear and helplessness she had felt. David struggled with feelings of betrayal, having expected military service to be challenging but honorable based on his family's history. Meanwhile, Commander Harrison was methodically building a case against everyone involved in the abuse. Security footage was being reviewed, medical records were being compiled, and witness statements were being taken from every recruit. The commander's approach was thorough and professional, ensuring that when charges were filed, they would stick. Marcus learned from one of the medical staff that Commander Harrison had been investigating reports of irregularities at the training facility for several weeks. Anonymous tips from concerned personnel had suggested that something was wrong, but the full extent of the abuse had not been understood until the commander witnessed it firsthand. "He actually went through the same training program you did," the medic explained quietly. "Except he did it undercover, posing as an observer, to see what was really happening. When he saw that live fire exercise today, he couldn't wait any longer to intervene." The revelation that Commander Harrison had been watching and gathering evidence while they suffered was initially difficult for Marcus to process. But, as he thought about it more, he realized that the commander had needed solid evidence to ensure that the perpetrators could be held accountable. Without proof, Davis and his accomplices might have escaped consequences and continued abusing other recruits. As evening approached, more high-ranking officials arrived at the facility. Marcus recognized the insignia of military police investigators and what appeared to be officers from the Judge Advocate General's office. The investigation was being treated with the seriousness appropriate to crimes committed against military personnel. Sergeant Davis and 3 other instructors who had been involved in the abuse were formally arrested that evening. Marcus watched from his barracks window as they were escorted away in handcuffs, a sight that brought him a satisfaction he hadn't expected. For 3 days, these people had seemed untouchable and all-powerful. Now they looked small and frightened as they faced the consequences of their actions. The formal arrest process was handled with military precision and attention to proper procedures. Commander Harrison made sure that every recruit witnessed the arrests, understanding that seeing justice beginning to unfold was an important part of their recovery process. Justice in the military means something, Commander Harrison explained to the assembled recruits after the arrests had been completed. When someone violates their oath and abuses their authority, especially to harm those under their command, the full weight of military law comes down on them. What happened to you will not go unpunished. That night, for the first time since arriving at the facility, Marcus slept peacefully. The barracks felt safe again, with proper security provided by personnel Commander Harrison had brought in to ensure the recruits' well-being. The atmosphere of fear and helplessness that had dominated the previous 3 days had been replaced by a sense of security and justice. The next morning brought news that the investigation had revealed even more serious misconduct than anyone had initially suspected. The training facility had been operating outside proper oversight for months, with Divas and his associates essentially running an unauthorized program that bore no resemblance to legitimate military training protocols. Financial irregularities had also been discovered, suggesting that the facility had been used to embezzle funds intended for proper training programs. The scope of the criminal enterprise was broader than just abuse of recruits. It involved fraud, conspiracy, and multiple violations of military law that would result in serious prison sentences for those involved. Commander Harrison personally briefed each recruit on what would happen next. They would all receive proper medical and psychological care. Their records would be cleared of any negative notations related to their experience at the facility, and they would be given the opportunity to continue their military service through legitimate training programs. What happened to you does not define your potential as soldiers, the commander explained. You showed courage and resilience under conditions that no one should have to endure. Those qualities will serve you well in legitimate military service, and you have my personal recommendation for any future training programs you choose to pursue. Marcus found himself in a private conversation with Commander Harrison later that day, one that would influence his entire future military career. The Navy SEAL had been impressed by Marcus's leadership during the crisis and his determination to protect his fellow recruits despite the personal cost. Have you ever considered special operations? The commander asked. What I observed over the past few days suggests you have the character and resilience we look for in elite units. Your performance under extreme stress was exemplary. The suggestion was unexpected and flattering, but Marcus needed time to process everything that had happened before making any decisions about his future. The trauma of the abuse was still fresh, and he wanted to make sure his next choices were based on genuine calling rather than reaction to his recent experience. Dr. Martinez provided additional counseling for all the recruits, helping them understand that their reactions to the abuse were normal and that healing was possible. She emphasized that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness, and that processing trauma properly would make them stronger soldiers and better people. The investigation continued for several more days, with investigators interviewing personnel throughout the military system who had knowledge of or responsibility for the training facility. The scope of the misconduct became clearer as more evidence was gathered, revealing a pattern of abuse and corruption that had been hidden from proper oversight for an extended period. Commander Harrison remained at the facility until every recruit had received proper care and been cleared for either medical leave or transfer to legitimate training programs. His commitment to ensuring their well-being and seeing justice done made a lasting impression on Marcus and influenced his understanding of what true military leadership looked like. As Marcus prepared to leave the facility and begin the next phase of his military career, he carried with him both the trauma of what he had endured and the inspiration of what he had witnessed in Commander Harrison. The experience had taught him that evil could exist even within institutions dedicated to honor and service, but it had also shown him that there were still people willing to risk everything to protect others and uphold the values that made military service meaningful. The fourth chapter of his ordeal was ending, but Marcus understood that the lessons he had learned and the example he had witnessed would influence the rest of his life and career. He had seen both the worst and the best of human nature, and he was determined to ensure that he would always stand on the side of those who protected rather than those who abused their power. 6 months after the events at the corrupt training facility, Marcus found himself standing in formation at a legitimate military training center, wearing the uniform he had dreamed of since childhood. The difference between this experience and his previous ordeal was like comparing daylight to darkness. Here, tough but fair instructors pushed recruits to excel while maintaining their dignity and safety at every step. The investigation into the abuse at the previous facility had resulted in court-martial proceedings that attracted attention throughout the military justice system. Sergeant Davis received a sentence of 15 years in military prison, along with dishonorable discharge and forfeiture of all benefits. His accomplices received similar sentences, sending a clear message throughout the armed forces that abuse of authority would not be tolerated. Marcus had testified at the court-martial proceedings, along with all the other victims of the abuse. The experience of confronting his tormentors in a courtroom setting had been challenging but ultimately healing. Seeing Davis reduced to a defendant facing justice had helped Marcus reclaim the sense of power and dignity that had been stripped away during those 3 terrible days. The testimony phase of the trial had been emotionally difficult for all the survivors, but it had also provided closure and vindication. Dr. Martinez had prepared them thoroughly for the process, and victim advocates had ensured that their rights were protected throughout the proceedings. The military justice system had worked exactly as it was designed to, holding the perpetrators accountable while supporting the victims. Peter, who had suffered the most severe psychological damage during the abuse, had been medically retired from military service with full benefits and ongoing counseling support. His recovery was progressing slowly but steadily, and he had expressed gratitude to Marcus and the other recruits for their support during the darkest period of his life. Marcus had chosen to continue his military career, but his experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to serve. He had developed a deep appreciation for ethical leadership and had made a personal commitment to protect others from the kind of abuse he had experienced. Commander Harrison had kept his promise to provide personal recommendations for the survivors who chose to continue their military careers. His endorsement had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, and Marcus had been accepted into several prestigious training programs based partly on the Navy SEALs assessment of his character under extreme stress. The legitimate training program Marcus was now completing was challenging in all the right ways. Instructors pushed recruits to their limits while maintaining safety protocols and treating everyone with the respect due to military personnel. Mistakes were corrected with firm but constructive feedback, not personal attacks or psychological manipulation. The contrast highlighted just how far outside normal parameters the abuse at the previous facility had been. Real military training was designed to build confidence, competence, and unit cohesion. The systematic cruelty they had endured had served no legitimate training purpose and had in fact been counterproductive to developing effective soldiers. Marcus had excelled in his new training environment, drawing on both the resilience he had developed during his ordeal and the clear understanding of right and wrong that the experience had given him. His fellow trainees had elected him to leadership positions, recognizing qualities that had been forged in the crucible of surviving systematic abuse. The psychological counseling provided by Dr. Martinez and her colleagues had been essential to Marcus's recovery and growth. He had learned to process the trauma without letting it define him, to distinguish between appropriate military discipline and abusive treatment, and to channel his experiences into positive motivation for protecting others. During one particularly meaningful counseling session, Dr. Martinez had helped Marcus understand that surviving the abuse had actually demonstrated strengths that would serve him well throughout his military career. "You maintained your integrity under conditions designed to destroy it," she explained. "You protected your fellow soldiers when it would have been easier to look out only for yourself. Those are exactly the qualities we want in military leaders." The media attention surrounding the court-martial proceedings had led to policy changes designed to prevent similar abuse in the future. New oversight procedures had been implemented for training facilities, regular inspections by outside authorities had been mandated, and reporting mechanisms had been improved to ensure that concerns could be raised without fear of retaliation. Commander Harrison had been promoted and assigned to a position where he could influence training policies throughout the special operations community. His intervention had not only saved Marcus and his fellow recruits from further abuse, but had also led to systemic changes that would protect future generations of military personnel. Marcus had maintained contact with several of his fellow survivors, and they had formed a bond that transcended their shared trauma. They supported each other through the ongoing process of healing and had committed to watching out for signs of similar abuse throughout their military careers. Sarah had chosen to pursue military intelligence training and was excelling in her new field. David had been accepted into officer candidate school and was preparing to carry on his family's tradition of military service in a way that honored rather than diminished the legacy. Each survivor had found a way to transform their experience into strength and purpose. The anniversary of their rescue had become an informal day of remembrance and gratitude for the group. They would send messages to each other acknowledging the date and expressing appreciation for their survival and recovery. It had become a positive ritual that marked their journey from victims to survivors to thrivers. Marcus had been contacted by victim advocacy organizations that wanted to use his story to help educate military personnel about recognizing and reporting abuse. He had agreed to participate in training programs, believing that sharing his experience could help prevent others from enduring similar treatment. The speaking engagements had been challenging at first, requiring Marcus to revisit painful memories in public settings. But the positive response from audiences and the knowledge that his story was helping to protect others made the emotional cost worthwhile. He had become an unexpected advocate for reform and accountability within the military justice system. As Marcus prepared to graduate from his legitimate training program, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The abuse he had endured had been terrible and unnecessary, but it had also revealed strengths he hadn't known he possessed and clarified values that would guide the rest of his life and career. Commander Harrison attended Marcus's graduation ceremony, having made a special trip to witness this positive milestone in the young soldier's journey. After the ceremony, he pulled Marcus aside for a private conversation that would set the stage for the next chapter of his military career. "I told you 6 months ago that you had the potential for special operations," the commander said. "Your performance throughout this training program has confirmed that assessment. If you're interested, I can arrange for you to attend selection for Navy SEAL training. You've already proven you have what it takes to succeed." The offer was both an honor and a challenge that Marcus had been hoping for since their first conversation. The SEAL training would be among the most difficult experiences the military offered, but it would also provide the opportunity to serve alongside the kind of ethical, competent leaders that Commander Harrison represented. Marcus accepted the offer immediately, understanding that it represented not just a career opportunity but a chance to pay forward the intervention that had saved him and his fellow recruits. As a SEAL, he would have the authority and ability to protect others from abuse and to uphold the values that made military service meaningful. The final chapter of this story was really the beginning of a new one. Marcus had survived systematic abuse, seen justice done, and emerged stronger and more committed to service than ever before. The wrong target had become the right person to carry forward the lessons learned and ensure that future generations of military personnel would be protected from those who would abuse their authority. Years later, as a successful SEAL team leader, Marcus would tell new recruits about the importance of ethical leadership and the responsibility every soldier has to protect others from abuse. His story had become part of the military's institutional memory, a reminder that honor and courage sometimes require standing up to those in authority when they violate the values they are supposed to represent. The transformation from victim to protector was complete, and Marcus understood that his true purpose had been revealed through his trials. He would spend the rest of his career ensuring that military training remained true to its purpose of building strong, ethical soldiers rather than breaking down vulnerable young people who had volunteered to serve their country.